because you're so knowledgeable at a very crucial time, and I'm really anxious to, hear from you what you think is going on and what might be done about this really dangerous situation. It seems to me. I'm really good to see you, Norton, always.
Thank you. It's nice to see you also.
Always. And I would welcome very much to Conversation, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Norton Mezvinsky, an old dear friend of Conversations and myself and the world. And he is, I've introduced him in the past, he's a distinguished professor of Middle Eastern history at the Connecticut State University. He's the author, co-author, along with Israel Shahak, the great scholar, Israeli scholar, who unfortunately passed recently, of a book called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. He had written, or was working on, we'll find out the progress, a book on Christian Zionism. And he's also had a long interest, he tells me, just as we start to talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, the relationship between the two. And he's also very clearly clued into what's going on this August 2nd of the year 2006 with all the things that are going on in Lebanon and the Middle East. And Norton, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you. It's nice to be here with you.
Always good to talk to you. It's a mess, huh?
It's a terrible mess.
Yeah.
It's a terrible mess.
Mm-hmm.
The situation, as you know, I'm sure, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict, that situation got worse at the end of September in 2000, and more people have been killed in Israel and Palestine since then than in the conflict before that, going back all the way to 48.
I mean, after they withdrew from Lebanon?
Yes, this is September 28th, 2000. That's when Ariel Sharon was the defense minister. That's when he went to the Temple Mount with about 1,000 Israeli police. And then there were outbreaks then, not of violence immediately, not of much violence, but then that grew and it became something that's been called the Second Intifada. And then we had, as you recall, those time periods for a couple years where Israel went into the West Bank, went into Gaza, and we had a good many people killed and many wounded. This is the period when we've had the Palestinian suicide bombers, and then we've had all of the Israeli bombing and strafing and killing and wounding of people and destruction of the infrastructure that existed. So as I said, from September 28th, 2000 until today, there have been more people killed and more people wounded in Israel-Palestine in that conflict than in the whole time period from 1948 up to that time period.
I hadn't realized that.
Now, in addition,
but
in addition to that, now in the past few weeks, we've had the outbreak of first violence in Gaza, and now violence in Lebanon. And so Israel has gone against Hamas, who they took a couple Israeli soldiers, and they killed a couple more, and Israel then went at them with its strong force.
Dug a tunnel or something.
Yeah, they did. And then Israel has now gone into Lebanon, as we know, as we sit here. They're currently...
You think it was pre-planned?
To go into Lebanon?
Yeah. Waiting for a pretext?
Yeah, well, there's a good deal of evidence that from the time that Israel came out of Lebanon fully,
that would have been 2000.
Yes, that's right. Let's say for the last 6 years that there have been plans to go in, at least to go in and to hit what has become Hezbollah. Hezbollah started that's right.
As a result of the occupation, I believe.
Right, that's right.
And Marine Barracks, 83?
Well, that goes back even further, that's right. But, yes, there's a good deal of evidence that there have been plans made and plans laid to be carried out at one point or another to go in, for Israel to go in again to Lebanon. What happened very recently with Hezbollah sparked that. So now we are probably in the very worst period of hostilities in this overall conflict that we have been in since the beginning of the conflict.
The growth of Hezbollah I've seen in the press, popular press that I read and everything, was an outgrowth of the occupation of Lebanon, and it grew. And the leaving in 2000 of Israel, was that something that there was a geostrategic or military necessity of them doing that, or was it, as they will say, an act of good faith on their part? What is the reality in terms of the leaving after 16 years of the Israeli military occupation, particularly of southern Lebanon? You read the history, you know what went on.
The Israeli government, of course, one government after another, would say it was a matter of their good faith.
Noblesse oblige.
That's right. But we also have a history going back to the 1982 invasion of Lebanon.
Right, sure.
A history that went through various stages. Israel came in to wipe out what were then the PLO forces right near and right on the Lebanese border with Israel. Israel was able to do that. The Palestinian leadership of Yasser Arafat, it was really the order of Yasser Arafat, stupidly, the order from that leadership was that the PLA, as it was called, the Palestine Liberation Army, should try to fight the Israelis straight up, and they were absolutely no match. It was only a matter of days that they were destroyed. Then we know Israel went all the way to Beirut, and then Israel went in with the idea of taking over and setting up a proxy government for Israel in Lebanon, which didn't work. The Lebanese were far better, many of them were far better at guerrilla warfare than the Palestinians had been. And so after a period of time, a year and a half, 2 years of guerrilla warfare, where we would say 1 or 2 Israeli soldiers would be killed or wounded every few days, the public sentiment in Israel built up against being in Lebanon. And so then Israel took out a good many of its forces from Lebanon. So that Lebanese guerrilla warfare worked very well indeed.
Was that Hezbollah based or partly or the growth of Hezbollah?
No, Hezbollah sort of grew from this situation that had developed. There were, of course, a few Lebanese who worked with the Israelis because they were opposed at the time to the Palestinians especially. But again, Israel took out most of its forces. Israel left in some forces. That occupation continued, as you said, until 2000. And then Israel took the rest of the soldiers out. The government of Israel liked to say, well, there was an understanding. Certainly the government of Israel had an understanding that there would not be groups that would be near the Israeli border that would stage raids into Israel and so on. Well, Hezbollah grew then after 2000, and Hezbollah grew. Hezbollah made up of Muslims who are Shiite Muslims.
They're Shia, yeah.
And they were, of course, aided, they were armed to a great extent by Iran.
Right.
And there's little question, almost no question, that much of the arms came through Syria. There was always a problem of Syria in Lebanon also. It's only recently that Syrian troops left.
After the assassination?
After the assassination of Harari, that's right, the president. But anyway, Syrian troops left, but Hezbollah kept growing in strength. And So we then have had this outbreak of hostilities, and there's been nothing like it in the past.
Right.
I mean, take, for one example, the hundreds of rockets per day for many, not all, but many of the last few days, hundreds per day that Hezbollah has shot that have gone over and hit and come
Haifa.
down in Israel, as far as Haifa and now
beyond.
even beyond
Yeah.
Haifa.
Uh-huh.
Well, if we go back to the early 1990s, when we had Desert Storm, the big news in this regard at that
Couple of
time
Scud missiles.
was that Saddam Hussein was able to shoot a few missiles over, very few, 3 or 4, that hit
Scuds,
in Israel.
right?
Scuds,
yeah.
that's right. Over the best at the time of the American anti-missile defenses
Patriot?
that were there. But that was big news. Saddam Hussein was, at least at that point, smart enough not to put warheads on them because that probably would have instigated Israeli bombing attacks in addition to the American bombing attacks upon Iraq. But the big news was that Saddam Hussein was able to send what was then called a psychological message to the Israelis that you can be hit, but they were only hit with 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Now we've come to the time period where they're hit with hundreds per day, which are, of course, far more advanced, that are not stopped by any kind of defense structure.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, and another event, if I may, in terms of that, because Hezbollah stands in a different way than traditionally the Arab countries surrounding Israel have come through to the peace process, supposedly, and that sort of thing. But you also had an election in Palestine among the Palestinians where they voted in Hamas.
They voted
and
Hamas.
if I may, both Hamas and Hezbollah say they do not recognize the legitimate right of Israel to exist.
Well,
Which is back to what they were saying at the beginning of the whole Zionist process, except it seemed to have been people were willing to, you know, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and others were willing to say, okay, they have the right, but they were people that say they don't, so they're back to square one in terms of the anti-Zionist proposition from the very get-go and the very premise that, you know, that sort of thing. That changes the dynamic, or
well,
what?
it's a bit more complicated.
I'm sure it is, yeah.
Hamas and Hezbollah, first of all, yes, they are military - political - social - economic groupings.
Yeah, they do a lot
that
of good
are
work.
that's
yeah.
right. That are important in all of those areas.
Right.
Um,
Building them great support.
That's right. Building up great support. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And that they built up political support by providing social services, health care, education, and a good many other things for the populations that need all of that.
Need it
Now,
terribly. In many cases, they have been
That's
terribly
right. Now,
treated. Yes.
So that's one part of the category.
Right.
Now, in terms of what you were talking about, well, that is more complicated. Let's take Hamas first of all.
Okay.
It's true that if you read what is their, well, we can call it their constitution, it's a terribly violent document.
Okay.
On the other hand,
Growing out of great anger.
growing out of great anger, violent in regard to Israel per se. On the other hand, mostly since Hamas was elected into power, but even before, there are a number of leaders in Hamas who have said now publicly, and I think this represents probably a majority of the Hamas leadership, they have said, look, if the state of Israel returns to its 1967 borders, and if we are allowed to have our Palestinian state, and we have a Palestinian state, and then we can work something out in terms of the return of some Palestinians who lost their property. None of these things Israel will accept.
Yeah.
But they say if that would be the case, then they would be willing to exist with an Israeli state of pre-1967 borders. Now, does Hamas, before we get to Hezbollah, do these Hamas leaders say, therefore, we accept the legitimate existence of the State of Israel? No. They don't use the term legitimate, but of course, that shouldn't be surprising. During the whole of the Cold War, from the Russian Revolution in 1917 up until the end of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, no United States government said, we recognize that the Soviet Union is legitimate, but of course, the United States recognized and dealt with, because it had to, the Soviet Union.
Right.
So acceptance of existence is one thing. Saying that saying that it's legitimate is something else. Now, with
that's up to the propagandistic spin masters.
There's a lot of propagandistic spin making here. That's correct. Now, in terms of Hezbollah, well, we cannot say that the Hezbollah leadership has gone so far, as I've just said, much of the Hamas leadership has gone. But on the other hand, Hezbollah has become also politically part of Lebanon.
No doubt.
We know there are Hamas people in the government of Lebanon, and this is a dynamic thing, and Hezbollah has now, we have had even Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah.
You think that's who they thought they might have had when they made that raid up into Becca?
Well, they probably thought they were going after him. But
they would love to capture him if they could.
They would love to kill him.
They would. They would, without a doubt.
But the point is that he also has indicated, look, if Israel did a number of things
that they are not ready to do.
That's right. Then even Hezbollah might be ready to sit down and to say, all right, Israel exists and Palestinians have their state. Hezbollah has a major concern with Palestinians. Lebanon exists as Lebanon is, and we might all be able to exist in this whole area.
He's made sounds along those lines?
He's made, even during the worst of this fighting, he's even made some of those sounds. Now, can we say that we know for sure that that would be the case with him and with Hezbollah? Can we say that we can definitely trust him fully and totally? The answer to that is perhaps not, but perhaps yes. But to use an oft-repeated slogan in the United States, it's probably worth giving peace a chance.
Thank you, John Lennon.
Giving peace a chance, because if we did, and we had an immediate ceasefire to what's happening in Lebanon, one thing we could say is that would stop, at least for the time being, and we'd hope that we'd expand the time being. That would stop the killing. That would stop the wounding.
But that would not disarm Hezbollah, or to make the facts on the ground one that Israel says they have to wipe it out and that kind of thing.
Well, but if the fighting goes on, the chances are that Hezbollah is not going to be wiped out anyway.
Apparently not.
Before there is a ceasefire.
I saw 87% of the people are in Lebanon, if they were not, are now in favor of Hezbollah and the idea of fighting. I can remember, a number of things I want to go into, one of being Mr. Ahmadinejad, or the fellow in Iran, saying a lot of very extremist kind of things about Israel and so forth, and that's there. But back when they were rolled into, and I looked it up, I think Israel, you can maybe know, Israel has something, you should understand, it is a super power. It has power, military power, well organized, well fought, and I think they have something on the order of 14,000 tanks and armored personnel.
Let me say a word or two about that. According to Jane's Fighting Ships, which is the major authority on military strength in the world, Israel is the fourth strongest military power in the world.
What is it, the United
Now,
States,
that's,
China, Britain?
I,
Who are
right,
the others?
now, let's say, Jane's fighting ship says the fourth,
Yeah.
even if it were the fifth or the sixth,
Yes.
Harold.
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
Where's the
now,
next one as
that
far as the
means-
Arab world?
That means in terms of traditional weaponry, weaponry, it was just pointed out on CNN and other media sources last week. It was just pointed out that Israel has the second largest air force in the world.
Wow.
Because of the United States.
Oh, it's all
now,
from the United
so,
States.
all right, now, so
Our
here
tax
we have
dollars at
here,
work.
now, and we're talking traditional
Yeah.
military equipment and traditional military equipment and weaponry. If we talk nuclear, then Israel at least
200?
is number 4 in the world.
At least.
We don't have exact counts of the stockpiles, but at least number 4.
Do
now,
we have any count? Or has there been any accounting? Or should there be?
There have been some estimates. I think there should be if we say that we should have nuclear inspections of lots of other countries. The question is, why not Israel?
Why not?
Why not
Yeah.
Israel? Because Israel says no, and the United States backs that up. But let's come back to military strength.
Yeah.
So Israel is certainly many, many, many times stronger militarily than the whole Arab world put together.
Right.
That's definitely the
Yeah,
case.
uh-huh.
And then to top it off, Israel has the superpower of the world, the United States, standing behind it,
Patting it
fully
on the
and
back.
Yeah. More than patting it on the back, having made it into this strong military power and also making it stronger by the day. Let's not forget that within the last 2 weeks, since Israel came into Lebanon, the United States has, by special delivery, as fast as it
Get those rockets.
sent
Yeah.
more bombs
Yeah.
over to Israel.
Yeah.
So
Fast track, yeah.
that's right,
Yeah.
fast track.
Uh-huh,
So there's no question about Israel being a major military
No
power.
question. And they've had that. I would submit they've probably been like that right from the get-go and everything like that, even though there's been touch and go a little bit from the beginning, and you'd be well familiar with that. But you have this thing. And with I can remember when they rolled into, I thought when Mr. Arafat was in Ramallah, and he was in his place there, and they rolled down, I think, with 4,000 tanks. And they rolled in, and they took the tank gun and stuck it right in the door and knocked out the electricity. And there was nothing. I don't know if you're talking, Hamas seems to be not as well backed economically as the Hezbollah. I don't know. I want to get that straight. But there was nothing the Palestinians could do as they rolled into Ramallah and across there with 4,000 tanks. And now there was no lobbying or ability for any lobbying of a rocket at Haifa. There was nothing the Palestinians could do with maybe standing on the street with a stone in their hand or something. But now Hezbollah is putting rockets into Haifa and into Israel. And instead of accepting, as the Israelis might like it to be, that it is inevitable, the legitimacy of the state of Israel, the basic premise upon which it is inevitable that that will be the superpower reality on the ground, has been questioned in the minds of much of the Arab, perhaps the Islamic, and the broader world that does not necessarily cotton to the idea that the United States and Israel, with their 2 votes in the United States, represents the international community. There's a lot of opposition to the superpower status of the both of them.
All right, now.
And that question of legitimacy is in their minds and not necessarily in the trend of history, and that legitimacy may be being brought into question by forces that are emerging in the world, perhaps out of the Arab, Islamic, and broader world, and the mass of the people who are not being served by the model that they claim to be legitimate.
All right, well, let's pick 2 or 3 of the very important things that you just mentioned. First of all, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, represented now by Hamas. Certainly, that is the most tragic, most unfortunate grouping. It's the most unfortunate situation of people in the whole area. Let us say that now we have 1.75 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2 million, let's say. We have 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza.
Just knocked out the power station.
Yeah, the Israelis did that. Yeah. But look, going back to 2000, but then having gotten even worse, we have a situation where if we take these 3.5 million Palestinians, the estimates are, and these are Israeli estimates that would certainly not be exaggerated. The estimates are that well over 50% of the population is below the line of subsistence.
Below the line of subsistence.
And the line of subsistence is measured at $2 American income per day per family. Over 50%,
per family.
Over 50% below that. The unemployment rate is off the chart, well over 60%. Now, if we didn't know anything else about a significantly large group of people anywhere in the world, except those two facts, 50% below subsistence, 65% or more unemployed, we could conclude, could we not, there's a lot of trouble there. Now, that's their status. Then, if we take what you mentioned, if we take what happened after the end of September through 2001 through 2002, when Israel moved in with tanks, and when the Israeli Defense Forces moved in, and they then destroyed a good deal of the existing infrastructure.
What little infrastructure there was left. What stone was left not on top of the other?
Then we have an even worse kind of situation. So the Palestinians represented by Hamas, that's a situation that is most tragic. Now, the situation in Lebanon, up until the last few weeks, when now the Israelis have come in and have destroyed a good deal.
Again, do you think they had that preset in their own mind and looking for
There were probably
pretext?
plans, well, either looking for or waiting for.
Maybe engineering. Maybe that's too far.
Some people think so, but we don't have evidence.
It's like, if I may, made it happen or let it happen in terms of the 9/11 truth movement in this country, which is another issue. But go ahead.
Okay. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's a different situation. Although there happen to be and have been a large group of Lebanese that have also been poor, their status,
they're pretty up there. They've been there a long time.
They're still not in the situation
that
Palestinians are in. Then we have other Lebanese, of course, who have been economically above them. But the groupings that are represented by Hezbollah have been the poorer groupings, but not in the same situation as the Palestinians.
They seem to be better supported if it's from Iran or from wherever than the Hamas.
Somewhat better
Who's supporting Hamas? I mean, what has Hamas got? They seem to be almost peculiar. I mean, they have very little economic capability to do things. It seems to me.
Well, they have, especially now, they have even less economic capability.
Because they are just
because the United States and the EU have cut off a good deal of the aid to Hamas. And the Israelis, there is tax
I think the Israelis are very upset that Hamas won the election. They would like to invalidate that whole electoral process that the Palestinians have manifested as a resistance to the dictate of Israel.
Not only the Israelis, but also the U.S. government.
Yeah, well, the Israeli and the U.S. are sort of more or less right in bed together.
But if we come now to just one other point that you had mentioned, if we come now to the United States and Israel, which are like this, right, and the United States behind Israel.
We could question why that is. Maybe that's being
Let's
questioned.
hold that for a minute.
Okay.
Let's hold that for a minute. But I'm saying that, well, if we come to that and we look at the United States, certainly today, we are at a high peak of antagonism to the government of the United States that we've never been at previously.
And that's all over the world.
That's in a great deal of the world, certainly in the Arab world, certainly among other parts of the world that have large Islamic populations.
1.4 billion, that's a lot of people.
That's right. But also, even in Europe, in much of Europe, and throughout a good deal of Asia, other than areas in which we have the majority of the population being the majority. The majority of the population being Islamic or being Muslim.
A lot of that growing in Latin America now, Mr. Chavez and things like that.
All of that is true. All of that.
So there's opposition to the assumed legitimacy. I saw a senator the other day saying the international community doesn't agree with what the Hezbollah are, and what he's talking about is the international community represents the United States-led cabal of people around the world, 10%, 20% of people doing well under the leadership of this, that our system is legitimate in a historical sense. The groundwork is being set for questioning the assumption of the legitimacy of the American model, and perhaps also the legitimacy in a historical sense of the Israeli Zionist model, perhaps. And there's a widespread mass movement because we have a system in place that is not adequate to what the future requires in terms of serving all the people. Perhaps that may be too idealistically thinking, but it seems to be in the wind.
In one phrase, to pick up your terminology, the American model, quote unquote, especially the model that we've had shaped by the Bush administration.
Well, that's just the frosting on the cake.
Simply is not working.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we also have the huge tragedy of Iraq here.
Awful.
That also, if we're talking about the prestige of the United States or the antagonism to the U.S. government, well, that has been moved upward a great extent and expanded by what the United States has done and is doing in Iraq.
There's so many things to talk about, but to what degree we have the neocons who did that, Mr. Wolfowitz and Pearl and that kind of thing. To what degree was the neocon? There seem to be a lot of Likudnik-minded, Israeli-minded people that are part of that neocon coalition that brought this drumbeat of Iraq, 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 and so forth. To what degree was it influenced by Israeli interests in mind that they wanted to destroy any kind of a possible threat to the Israeli hegemonic control of the whole Middle Eastern area, which some people think in terms of greater Israeli, with the superpower status that they have in terms of establishing control over that whole area in a colonial way, like we're going to beat the Wogs into submission and take control. To what degree was the neocon Iraq thing Israeli-based or strongly Israeli influenced in your estimation?
Well, we have people who have so theorized. I think that we don't have the evidence to say that the decision to go into Iraq in 2003 and then the decision to do what the United States government has been trying to do in Iraq, I don't think we have the evidence to say that that was really something that was inspired in a major sense, motivated in a major sense, or planned by concern for Israel, or as you call them, Likudniks. There's no question that some of the people, let's take Wolfowitz himself.
He was the one who really did, from the 70s. They were talking about the new American century.
There is no question that...
and nobody's gone in the dock.
There's no question that we've had a few people, Wolfowitz's one of the leading
Now he's the head of the World Bank.
That's right. One of the leading examples who worked with Likud politicians
Right.
in Israel, and also had, of course, plans from the early 1990s with Desert Storm to go back into Iraq.
That used to be called the lunatic. It goes back to the 70s. That was the lunatic fringe.
All right, but
and now they're in control of things.
But to make the argument that President George W. Bush and his administration, then backed by Congress, unfortunately, decided to go into Iraq a few years ago and stay and do what has been done, to say that that was all because of a concern about Israel.
No, not to say it's all. A serious part of a collaboration between two countries that had a similar view, and that it tied up with the Zionist view of a greater Israel. They're a superpower. They can control. From the Nile to the Euphrates. It's still on the building. It's still on the Knesset.
Well, no, it's not there.
It's not? Oh,
No,
is that a rumor?
It's not there.
Oh, okay.
It's not there. I don't really think that's the case.
It in. Okay,
I don't really think that's the case.
Okay.
And insofar as the Israeli government is concerned, and I think this has been the case, for most of the time that Israel has been a state, for not only the great majority, but almost all of the people, except for some of those that Israel Shahak and I wrote about in our book on Jewish fundamentalism in Israel. The idea of the greater Israel that was there, the greater Israel that would include a good deal of the Arab Middle East, I think that has not been, nor is it, a concern.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that. Abraham was from Ur, I think.
All right. That's right.
Yeah.
But what is a concern is that the state of Israel as it's presently constituted, which includes the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights taken from Syria, that the Israel of 2006, that Israel should remain as it is, which is a Jewish Zionist state. That, I think, is the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Is that like apartheid?
Certainly. Certainly. Different than the Union of South Africa. It's not based upon something racial, but it's based upon this, it's based upon the concept that was put by Theodore Herzl, the concept being an absolute theory of anti-Semitism.
Right, we ought to talk about that.
All right, fine. That is to say that, and I think this is the heart of the conflict.
You've been researching this, actually. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism.
I just wrote a long article that's going to be a chapter of a new book.
Might be worth talking about in the open.
Okay, but let me finish
All right,
this.
I'm sorry.
All right.
Go ahead.
This, I think, is the heart of this conflict. George W. Bush has said in the last 2 weeks, boy, we need to solve the root of this situation in Lebanon, and he claims that's Hezbollah. No, the root is the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the root of the Arab-Israeli conflict is Zionism. Theodore Herzl put it. It's the political Zionism of Theodore Herzl. It's based upon an absolute theory of anti-Semitism. That is to say, Jews have been in the past, and/or are being in the present, and/or will be in the future, persecuted in all nation states wherein they are a minority. Therefore and thereby, so goes the argument, Jews need a nation state of their own in which they start out as the majority.
And hopefully, stay so.
That's right. Hopefully of the residents, but if not, then of the citizens who control the state, and they remain so. Now, that's the absolute theory of anti-Semitism that's been legislated into the character of the state, and so the state, therefore, in law, there's nothing above the law, no constitution in Israel. By law, that state grants rights and privileges to Jews not granted to non-Jews, even the ones who were citizens of the state. That's the heart of the conflict.
And they do that.
And that's what makes this analogous. So that means it is an apartheid state in a sense. It makes it analogous to other apartheid states, even though it's based upon a religious, Theodore, we can't say partially religious. He was, well, at least an agnostic. But it's based upon this concept, religious for some, ethnic, cultural for others. It's based upon this theory of absolute anti-Semitism.
Now, that's something that might be well to be addressed, that kind of thing, because you have that, and I can remember, and I wanted to thank, I did it off camera, I'll do it on camera, I wanted to thank you enormously for having arranged to make sure that I was able to have a chance to meet Israel Shahak. He was a grand gentleman, a grand man.
He was a great man.
And he was a genius, as you say, and a very and so he had written a book called, you know the title exactly, it's 3,000 Years.
Jewish history, Jewish religion,
The weight
of 3,000 years.
Of 3,000 years. And he said in there, he addressed the idea of anti-Semitism in a way that was really startling to me, if I may, and I want you to set me straight, because the anti-Semitism premise of Mr. Herzl or of the Jewish thing, and if someone were to criticize Israel, if they're not Jewish, they will be called anti-Semitic, and if they are Jewish, they'll be called self-hating Jew. I mean, so that's the thing that comes back to anyone who criticizes Israel and so forth. And he said that anti-Semitism was something that they said has been part of them since the diaspora, a couple thousand years when they were evicted by God's decree to leave because of their sin. But anyway, they were living among people that had local warlords and that sort of thing. They were a little bit isolated from the community that was there, the established community. Those established community had warlords that had a certain amount of sway, the warlord du jour, or the people that had some control. And the Israeli people had been scholarly, or there had been the Talmudic study, that sort of. They had some capability, and many of them, not all of them, a lot of them were in shtetls and things like that, but many of them became very gifted and able to serve the interests of the local warlord du jour. Some local landed estate or something. And then if there was an uprising again, and then they would serve as bailiffs and as tax collectors and things like that, lived pretty well, by and large, a great number of them. Then if there was an uprising against that local warlord, maybe another warlord or his mafia gang or whatever, then it would be directed, the hatred would be directed at the Jews who had served as collaborators to that warlord who was overthrown. Is there anything to that? Or what is the source of anti-Semitism other than the prescription that seems to be made by Herzl and others that it's something genetic in the genes of the rest of the human society? They're going to hate Jews because maybe, like Mr. Bush says, they hate freedom or something. But what is the source of the anti-Semitism that has manifested over the history? And is it anything to do with this idea that they had served a local interest? They are now serving the interests of the United States of America. The United States of America, like Rome, is being hated by a great number of the people of the world. And if that changes, that dynamic changes, there's going to be a lot of anger directed at the people who set up the State of Israel and Zionism itself in that same analogy, if you can follow all of that.
All right, well,
since you're addressing the issue of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
First of all, we certainly do not have anywhere near a clear and definitive answer to the question of why anti-Semitism has remained in this world, sometimes greater, sometimes lesser, in some areas as opposed to other areas for, let's say, 2 millennia. Yeah. We don't have a near definitive answer.
Israel Shahak made this suggestion to me when I did the program
All right.
with him.
all
that
right.
it had to do
Yes,
with this.
that's
It wasn't some genetic defect in the rest of
it's
humanity
not-
other
no.
than Jews,
We can
as they
rule-
seem to
we can-
proclaim.
We can rule out.
It had
it's-
some basis
we
in
can
fact
rule
in
out.
historical
Yeah,
development.
there's no question.
Okay.
We can rule out.
And applies today. That
We
people
can-
who are
we-
against
we-
Israel
yeah,
are not
that's all true.
anti-Semitic by some
we
genetic
can rule
defect.
out genetic factor.
Thank you.
I mean,
well, I was
sci-
being facetious in a
Yes,
sense.
I
So you
understand.
understand what I'm saying? Because
I
they say
do.
it just comes out of the air, nothing
No.
to do with what they're doing.
So
Or those who
In-
support what they're doing.
that's right. In essence, then, we have a good deal of theorizing about this.
Yeah.
If we take Jews themselves, I would say that the analogy to something that has not really been answered definitively is the question of who is a Jew or what is a Jew? I have a very good friend who's not Jewish who keeps telling me, listen, Norton, if you Jews can't decide
Yeah.
who is a Jew,
How the hell
then
can
how
we?
can you? That's right. How
Yeah,
can
right,
we?
right,
How can we?
right.
So I'm saying now, in a really negative way, we can say the same in a sense about anti-Semitism. Although we know that it's existed. Sometimes there are a number of people who exaggerate it terribly in terms of its existence.
It's a political
Sometimes-
ploy.
That's right.
Yeah.
But sometimes the Holocaust
There is there.
the
Yeah.
Holocaust is a leading example. Sometimes it's not exaggerated. I mean, that was almost genocide
Yeah.
in that part of the world.
It's not
But-
been well enough explained to me where the hell it came from. Where did that come from?
What
The genocide represented by the Holocaust in Europe in the 1930s. Where did that anger and that racist irrationality come from? I've never been able to understand it in any dimension at all.
We at least would need to have another program.
I know. I asked you
to-
30 seconds one time I did a program. I gave
Yes,
you 30
we
seconds.
would at
sound
least
bite.
need, especially, I mean, here.
But it's an important
here-
question.
It's
We've
very
only got
important,
sound bites,
and that's
but
why
try and
we have
address it rather than
that-
just accept it.
No, that's why we have we have a huge literature of the Holocaust, as you know,
Yeah.
some of which isn't worth very much, but a lot of it is really in-depth, and we should try to go into that sometime. But I'm saying we have today one important development of all of this is, as you have inferred and suggested, one important development is that anti-Semitism has been used by too many, not all, but too many, Israeli apologists and Israeli propagandists to attack any criticism whatsoever of the state of Israel.
Right.
The idea is, as you suggested, the idea here is that if you are critical of Israeli policies, especially if you're an anti-Zionist, then you are an anti-Semite.
They try and tie the
That's
same together.
why, for example, I said when you asked me, I've just written a long article.
You have?
It's
Is
going
it-
to
is
be
it-
a chapter of a new book.
Is it not
that has-
available publicly yet? Is there a
it's
site
not
for it?
available yet. Give it 6 months.
Okay.
But I finished writing it.
As
The
usual,
title of-
you're on the cutting edge.
well,
Norton
the title of
Mezvinsky.
it is Anti-Zionism Anti-Semitism? I, of course,
big subject.
as a Jewish anti-Zionist,
Yeah.
say definitely
Yeah.
not.
Uh-huh.
And I go into this undue, unwarranted, dangerous charge that if you're opposed to Zionism, as by the
You're a
way,
Nazi.
great majorities of Jews have been since the 1890s, if you are opposed to that, you are somehow an anti-Semite. I'm saying that's been a propaganda ploy by too many Zionist apologists. And unfortunately, that's been a ploy that has worked to a goodly
Sure,
extent
you can
in the
silence
United
anybody.
States.
Absolutely.
especially. In the United States. Well,
Absolutely.
you can't silence anybody. I mean, there are some of us that are not silenced
Yeah, that's right,
by
right.
that at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
But you are correct in saying there are people who have been silenced, and there are people who have been maneuvered by this,
Well-
been maneuvered by the threat of if you don't support
Absolutely.
the state of Israel,
Yeah.
then you'll be labeled an anti-Semite.
And there goes
when
your political career.
That's
Right.
That's
And
right.
they have
and this
torpedoes.
applies to a good many
Yeah.
people who have been
Paul
in the
Finley.
Congress
Yeah,
of the United
yeah,
States.
a lot, yeah.
And then it applies to a good many others as well who have backed away from being critical of even oppressive Israeli policies. They backed away from that because of the threat of being called an anti-Semite. That is, let me understate it, most unfortunate. Most unfortunate.
And very prevalent in terms of the current situation and so on, and should be addressed now. And what does it say? One of the things is that the Mr. Ahmadinejad, I can't pronounce his name, the Iran fellow, he says the president of, and he represents that now you're built with every school bombed and children killed in Lebanon, the anger is growing. Hezbollah is now attacking the idea of Israel. Is it possible that the legitimacy of the state, that Zionism was, in a historical sense, a wrong idea? The establishment of the state of Israel was a wrong thing, a bad thing for the Jewish population,
yes,
and that ought to be able to put forth, rather than that being some sort of holy writ or some principle that can't. Why are we, the United States of America, so tied into that idea, which has led to so much trouble in the world, unparalleled support? Our tax dollars going to buy Apache helicopters and all these kind of things that run that. Why are we so into that? And why don't we begin to question, is it in our national interest to follow the Zionist notion that was the crackpot idea, perhaps, of a few people, radical people, who did something and took over, in many people's mind, the spirit of Judaism, mocked the idea of Moshiach, that sort of thing, and that we support it? And why are we allowing them? And who is it that who is the dog and who is the tail when it comes to the relationship between the United States and Israel? And shouldn't that question be debated without being called anti-Semitic, being thrown at it, and no political power be able to gain in this country? And why isn't it? And maybe it should be. And what do you think?
The good thing about you, Harold, and the good thing about being on this program is you bring up a number of fascinating, terribly important, significant issues. Sometimes, however, you throw them all out.
All in one bomb, huh?
All in one bomb.
Yeah. No, it's a big question. No, it is a big question, and it's one that's very important to the world.
Let me pick out just a couple of these things. One is, if we talk about the president of Iran, there we're talking about a person who is either a fully committed, bona fide anti-Semite, and/or is a person who is, at least in regard to this issue, mad. He's crossed the line. So there we're talking about, I mean, his statements are clearly and in a pure sense, in many ways, anti-Semitic.
Wait a minute, if I may. Put in a word for Mr. Ahmadinejad.
Okay.
Right? He says, the Arabs did not do the Holocaust. The Germans did. Give them Bavaria.
No.
Why do that has a certain logic to it.
I'm not saying everything he says is wrong.
Well, take him individually.
I'm saying that when he talks about Jews, and he talks about
what does he say?
The negative features of Jews, that's classic anti-Semitism.
What has he said? The negative features of Jews.
Yes, he
has.
has.
Oh, he has. Send me the links, right?
Okay.
It seems to me a lot of that is directed at Zionism.
No. If it's directed at Zionism, it's something else.
Right.
But now let me come
Is it legitimate to is it legitimately able to somebody criticize Zionism in this world or not? Much of the world feels that way.
Harold, you're asking me, and for half a century, I've been an anti-Zionist.
I know.
I've criticized Zionism.
Elmer Berger.
I've said Zionism is something negative, for Jews and non-Jews alike.
And the world.
I think that we should not have an exclusivist Jewish state, which is what a Zionist state is, any more than we ought to have an exclusivist Islamic state like Saudi Arabia,
or Episcopalian,
or that's right, or an exclusivist Christian state, or an exclusivist white state, as we'll say the Union of South Africa was. I'm opposed to all exclusivist states. This exclusivist state, that is to say the Zionist state, the state of Israel, it happens to be in an area of the world where we have now 5.7 million Jews in the state of Israel.
And 1.4 billion Islamic people.
And in the Arab Middle East, let's say we have 250 million anyway, non-Jews. And we have precious few Jews left anywhere else in the Middle East.
And they're getting assimilated.
All right. So I'm
marrying
saying,
all kinds of Gentiles
that
and
here, pragmatically, it's even a more severe problem. But I'm saying that, yes, of course, my answer is that we should have, instead of a Jewish state that's a Zionist state, we ought to have a state that guarantees equal rights and equal privileges for everybody.
And we ought to have a world like that.
We ought to have a world like that.
We don't.
We don't.
The system, the legitimacy, the assistance and the legitimacy of, I'll say, the American model, the Washington consensus, is inadequate to what the future requires. Jews may have been of service by so associating with that group, like they did with warlords in medieval Russia, and that is not, they will be able to be the means by which the world, intellectuals, will be able to effectively challenge the assumed legitimacy of the American system, so we might bring a system that's going to work for everybody, because the system in place now is inadequate to what the future requires. That's what I'm saying.
All right. Well, to come
a big dialectic challenge.
All of this is a very big challenge. But again, let me underline and emphasize that the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been a major conflict now for almost 60 years, the heart of this conflict
run the credits, I think,
is the Zionist character of the state of Israel. And that if we had a state that was, as Elmer Berger put it,
God bless him,
was a de-Zionized state, and we had a state, as many Israeli Jews, or growing numbers of Israeli Jews, even still a minority, are beginning to say, if we had a truly democratic state there that guaranteed, at least in law, as I've said before, equal rights and equal privileges for at least all of the citizens, then we would have not only a far better situation, we would have opened the door and gone through it towards peaceful resolution.
And to a model that's worthy of emulation by the peoples of the world, and we don't have it now.
That's correct.
All right, good. And that's something that we have to do, and this may be, in a certain sense, the means by which I think it's, again, the question of being able to challenge the American